say it, but I say this is the most exciting moment to student group, so welcome back. I'm not the speaker, but I just want to quickly plan out our lineup of lectures this fall. As those of you who maybe are new, second years, graduate students, didn't come to the lecture so much last year. We get together every Thursday at 2 p.m. in this room to talk about architecture. About all sorts of different perspectives about architecture, different topics. Every week there's a lecture, except for 2 weeks when there's fall break and a football game. He lives in Iceland. So we've got quite a few of our esteemed faculty giving lectures. The lectures in red are hosted by our student lecture committee. And I'm sure if you are interested in joining the student lecture committee, what can be done? See Kristen Washka. She will point you in the right direction. Send Kristen an email if you're interested in joining the student lecture committee. I do want to point out that the lecture on September 26th, Lauren Scarpa from Brooks and Scarpa, is an amazing opportunity. You absolutely do not want to miss. And then the lectures in blue are some really interesting other special guests being brought by the school or the college. Lucy McRae makes wearable architecture. That's also really, really interesting things. And Carl De Silva is an alumni of our program who is a principal at Perkins & Will in Chicago and has written a really interesting new book about the Danish chair. Has gone on this incredibly deep dive, and he's going to talk to us about that. Yeah? So over to you.
Thank you. So, can you hear me okay? Is that decent? Okay. So welcome back. I'll say it as well. Many of you were in architectural offices on internships this past summer. You're back at school. School should be a little different than the office, I hope. I was remembering my first week in Cogill Hall, and it's many years ago, almost 40 years ago. I was working in the building well after midnight on something, and I walked into the men's restroom on the 4th floor, and it was full of people, about 12 people, male and female, huddled around an overturned trash can in the middle of the floor, and on the trash can was sitting a reel-to-reel, one of those old-fashioned kind of tape recorders. And they were reading aloud passages from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake and recording it, on that recorder. And I suppose they chose the restroom because of the acoustics. But, I said, pardon me, and found a restroom elsewhere in the building. But I remember that moment and thinking, what kind of a place an architecture school is. And this one in particular, because, that kind of thing didn't happen in the school that I had gone to as an undergraduate. We didn't, you didn't see things like that happening. Here were architecture students pulling an all-nighter or at least staying up well after normal bedtime, seriously engaged in some kind of activity that apparently had nothing to do with a studio or course assignment. They were receiving no academic credit for this activity. And over the years, I've made it kind of a practice to wander around our school and other schools of architecture after midnight, just to see what was going on. And while a lot of people were dutifully engaged in working on their projects, the assignments that were given, There were also lots of other kinds of activities, self-initiated undertakings that people were involved in. Those activities, no doubt, were supported and encouraged by faculty, perhaps, but they weren't responses to assignments, and they weren't done for credit. I once produced a top 10 list of these, but that's meaningless to you since David Letterman has been off the air for probably 10 years or so. So I'll just hit a few highlights of some of the things I observed over the years that architecture students were doing after midnight in our school. So here's the first one. On the pavement behind Kogel, with the assistance of some of her studio colleagues, an architecture student had placed 2 sheets of plywood side by side. Over this, she was spreading some kind of concoction in 5-gallon buckets. In response to my question, she said she was manufacturing a very large sheet of paper, almost 8 feet by 8 feet. When the contents of the buckets had been sort of deposited, she added 2 more sheets of plywood on top and proceeded to run over it with her car to press the water out. When I asked what she planned to do with this giant sheet of paper, she said she hadn't yet determined that. On a table in the corner of the 3rd floor, I observed a row of large aluminum foil roasting pans. You know, the kind you would use to cook a Thanksgiving turkey in? And they were filled with various liquids. You know, one was kind of amber colored, one was kind of cyan, one was really dark, almost black, sort of a dark gray color. Adjacent to the pans were 2 automobile batteries with jumper cables attached. The other ends of the cables were connected to metal plates immersed in some of those pans of liquid. Bubbling sounds emerged and light smoke arose from the pans. I couldn't really tell if it was an etching operation or a plating operation. I didn't want to get too close. And then the last one I'll mention, although there are many, on the occasion of the death of architect Aldo Rossi, so I think that was about 1997, a group of students under the guidance of some faculty members, and I think Shelley Martin was involved, and Mark Blizzard, who left to go to University of Texas, San Antonio, they conceived and executed a memorial in the Kogel Hall lobby. They collaborated to construct a framework that spanned across sort of the neck of the lobby, and it had a large funnel attached at the midpoint. Over the weekend, they repeatedly climbed that framework and poured many, many bags of play sand into that funnel. Consultation with structures professor Mario Cortez did confirm that the 2,000-pound pile of sand would not collapse the concrete floor slab. As the sand pile grew, you know, dropping from that center point, a perfect cone was produced because the sand, of course, had a consistent angle of repose. So if you drop the sand in one little point, it will gradually build up this perfect cone. The cone in the end was about 6 feet high, and it spread almost to the edges of sort of the neck of the lobby. That was quite beautiful. When I arrived in the lobby on Monday morning, a team of janitors was gathered around trying to decide if this was a monument or a mess to be cleaned up. Well, they were persuaded it was the latter, and this beautiful sand cone stayed in the lobby for about a week. So these were not trivial kinds of activities. They were serious projects. They involved research, construction of equipment and tools. I hope such endeavors still occur and that people see something worthwhile in such activities just for themselves, regardless of whether they're receiving any credit. When we created the School of Architecture and Design, now slightly over 20 years ago, Frank, of course, remembers this, because he was the department head and the first director of that school. Now, of course, we're two schools, the School of Architecture and the School of Design. We deliberately chose the name school for the entity that we would become. We had previously been the Department of Architecture. Let me advance the slides here. Those are some of the definitions of what a school might be. We did not intend to imply a consistent ideological or theoretical school of thought. That's one of those further down, I think. But rather to affirm our educational priorities. The ancient Greek word skole, right? That's right at the bottom, tells you where the word school comes from, is the root for the English word school and all the other related words like scholar, scholarship. We're going to look up what that means. So Nick has graciously offered to look this up for us. So this is a book called the Greek English Lexicon. Nowhere in the university, nowhere but the university, will you see an old guy carrying a big old book, around like this anymore. Anyway, the word school comes from this Greek word, ancient Greek, skole. We don't exactly know how the Greeks pronounced it. They didn't have accents, so it's not skole. Maybe they actually had musical intervals, so it could have been skole, skole, musical intervals or something. But anyway, we'll do the best we can. So Nick, here it is. And I want you to read what it means.
It says leisure, rest, and ease.
Wait, what?
Le-
Madhumita, check him, make sure he's right.
Yes.
You're confirming.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Madhumita. Appreciate it. Leisure, rest, ease. Huh. I mean, is that surprising that that's what school means? A school would be a place of leisure? I mean, some of you are probably thinking, after maybe 14 to fifth year students, maybe 18 years of formal schooling, that is not consistent with my experience. But according to the ancient Greeks, a school is a place of leisure. So let's make a deal here. I promise not to tell your parents about this if you agree not to inform the state legislature, okay? It'll be our little secret. And just to confirm, that's the page from that lexicon, and there it is right up at the top, skole, leisure, rest, ease, and then all the ancient Greek texts where that word can be found. And, while the gospel of work is often preached in schools, especially architecture and design schools, the gospel of leisure seems much better news, doesn't it? But before we put our feet up and take the rest of the day off, we need to kind of delve a little bit into what the ancient Greeks thought about leisure. And I'll just put this image up. You can kind of peruse that while I'm talking about this a little bit. Unfortunately, the term leisure has suffered from a lot of misinterpretation and degradation in our contemporary usage. In our pragmatic society, all serious activity is defined as work, and activities which are not instrumental for the life of the individual or of society, activities not associated with making a living, are classified as mere hobbies. As Hannah Arendt says, superfluous luxuries to fill our time when not engaged in work. And I've got to sort of give a shout out to one of our alumni. And in fact, interestingly, Jonathan mentioned this person's name just half an hour ago. Shelley Sulik, one of our former students, went to Europe, and a few years after she graduated, she sent me a note, and she said, I think you would really enjoy this book. It's by a guy named Joseph Pieper, and it's called Leisure, Basis of Culture. It's a great read, and it really kind of changed my thinking about what this idea of leisure might be. So in contrast to our current attitudes toward leisure, in the Politics, Aristotle, you all know who Aristotle is, he says, we work in order to have leisure. Now, I don't know about you, but, you know, when I was in high school, my father would wake up at 5 a.m. He would go outside my bedroom window and proceed to rake the leaves off the sidewalk. You know, I mean, that was a sign, it's time to work, son. And, you know, we were kind of trained that work was the most important thing. If you had time for anything else, well, that's great. But, you know, it was a sort of ethic of total work. But a literal translation confirms it in Aristotle. He says, we are unleisurely, scholia, in order that we can have leisure, schole. In Latin, the word for leisure is otium. Not leisure, the word for work is negotium. Right? We get our word negotiate, means busyness, right? So leisure is the opposite of busyness, right? Work for work's sake, perhaps. We often tend to think of leisure as free time, entertainment, recreation for the sake of improving or restoring our capacity to work. What we do on the weekend so that we can become better workers when we come in on Monday morning. But Aristotle and the ancient Greeks identified this kind of activity as quite distinct from leisure. So I'm going to read a long passage from Aristotle, but I think it's kind of important. It's true that both occupation and leisure are necessary. But it is also true that leisure is higher than occupation. It is the end to which occupation is directed. We can hardly fill our leisure with recreation. To do so would be to make recreation the be-all and end-all of life. That's impossible. Recreation is a thing to be chiefly used in connection with one side of life, the side of occupation. A simple argument shows that this is the case. Occupation is the companion of work and exertion. The worker needs relaxation. Recreation is intended to provide relaxation. Leisure is a different matter. We think of it as having in itself intrinsic pleasure, intrinsic happiness, intrinsic felicity. Happiness of that order does not belong to those who are engaged in occupation. It belongs to those who have leisure. It is clear, therefore, that there are some branches of learning and education which ought to be studied with a view to the proper use of leisure in the cultivation of the mind. It is clear, too, that these studies should be regarded as ends in themselves, while studies pursued with a view to an occupation should be regarded as means and matters of necessity. There's another good definition of leisure that I rather like by a guy named Sebastian de Grazia. Leisure is defined as a state of being in which activity is performed for its own sake or as its own end. Scholed depends on freedom from labor associated with survival and the distractions of necessity. So as the philosopher enjoys leisure, he or she is free to pursue a line of reasoning wherever it may lead in the search for truth. The painter at leisure is free to see clearly and tell plainly what he or she sees and to search for form, color, etc., without worrying whether their painting will sell. During the Industrial Revolution, this was kind of a big deal because society was transforming, right? So the peasant farmer whose day was kind of governed by the cycles of nature had been basically converted into a tender of machines. And those machines could go on working, in season and out without stopping. And the machines were, people were in danger of being worked to death by the machines. John Ruskin wrote a little introduction to The Economist of Xenophon, and he says, Xenophon dwells on the evil of occupations at the furnace, especially their ascolia, want of leisure. The furnace is basically, devouring you as a human being. You have no leisure if you are tending the furnace. He also adds the footnote, modern England, with all its pride of education, has lost that first sense of the word school. Until it recover it, it will know no other rightly. By the way, let me just stop for a second. I forgot to mention one thing. This book that Nick was reading out of, it's written by a guy named Henry Liddell. You know who Henry Liddell is? Ever heard of him? Kind of an important in the world of education. No? He was the dean of Christ Church College at Oxford and later the vice chancellor of the university, so kind of an important guy in the 1870s. You probably know his daughter better than him. Her name was Alice Liddell. Alice Liddell? No? That Alice, yeah. She's the one that Lewis Carroll, a.k.a. Charles Dodson, wrote those stories about, to amuse the children, probably to amuse himself at Oxford. Okay, just an aside. Leisure is often associated with the contemplative life, in contrast to the vita activa, which is the active life or the world of work. To contemplate something is to look in a disinterested way at it. And I've got to be careful here because the word disinterested doesn't mean uninterested. You can be very interested in something and still look at it disinterestedly, right? What disinterested means is something closer to impartial. I don't have a stake in the outcome of this inquiry. I'm free to pursue it wherever it leads me, with no vested interest in the outcome. And Heraclitus called it listening to the essence of things. In the Middle Ages, there was an idea that you had a kind of simple intuition where truth offers itself like a landscape to the eye. Isn't that a beautiful formulation? You're just receptive at that point. So leisure kind of is associated with aesthetic contemplation. And Erwin Panofsky says that really nicely. It's possible to experience every object, natural or man-made, aesthetically. We do this when we look at it or listen to it without relating it intellectually or emotionally to anything outside of itself. When a man looks at a tree from the point of view of a carpenter, he will associate it with the various uses to which he might put the wood. And when he looks at it from the point of view of an ornithologist, he will associate it with the birds that might nest in it. When a man at a horse race watches the animal on which he's put his money, he will associate its performance with his desire that it will win. Only he who simply and wholly abandons himself to the object of his perception will experience it aesthetically. So that's kind of interesting. I actually like this formulation of Stephen Hall. I'll adjust the lights down a little bit here. I won't read the whole thing, but just point out one little part. To open ourselves to perception, we must transcend the mundane urgency of things to do. We must try to access that inner life that reveals the luminous intensity of the world. Isn't that a beautiful idea? You have stuff on your to-do list. I quit making a to-do list because it just kept expanding, right? Sometimes, you know, you have to transcend the mundane urgency of things to do. There might be some things that, you know, despite that urgency, don't actually need to be done, and some other things that might be more important. Okay, so now the sort of getting into the topic of the lecture. So that suspension of the tyranny of urgency does not necessarily have to happen after midnight. This is an image of architect Le Corbusier's painting studio. Here's another image. And there's Le Corbusier in that studio. In 1948, Le Corbusier referred to his studio where he spent all of his mornings, then moving to his architectural office to work on professional projects in the afternoon. He called this his secret laboratory. He saw this experimentation with drawing and painting as the source of his architectural research. So here's what he said: I think that if my architectural work has value, then its essential value must be attributed to that secret work. Every day of my life has been partly devoted to drawing. I've never stopped drawing and painting, seeking the secrets of form wherever I could find them. There's no need to look anywhere else for the key to my work and my research. This is Le Corbusier's first painting. It's called the chimney piece. He's sort of looking at sometimes it's called the fireplace. He's looking at it and trying to discern certain primary forms. So there's that little cube that's sort of sitting on the mantelpiece that he's particularly focusing on. And in 1917, he and the painter Amédée Ozenfant together set out to reform Cubism. They started a group called the Purists. They thought Cubism had become romanticized, decorative, frivolous, lost its mojo, so to speak. So they wanted to return to the approach of Cézanne, painting to search for primary forms and relationships without superfluous surface articulation, the inner nature of objects rather than their outward appearance. And here's some of those early paintings that Le Corbusier did. I'll just go through these. They had this idea of primary form, and best way I can explain it to you is, you know, they said, if you give every human being a perfect cube, right, no matter when they lived, where they live, it will elicit certain sensations from any human being. They call those primary sensations. And then there are a whole host of secondary ones, right? If I took that cube and I painted it white and I put black dots on the surface, then of course, some of us would associate that with a die, a pair of dice, games of chance, whatever. Someone who was not part of a culture where that was commonplace would just see that as a decoration on the surface, right? Those are secondary sensations or secondary aspects of form. So they were interested in primary forms. So some of these objects are reduced to kind of cylinders, cubes, other kind of simple forms, unadorned, right? Without a lot of surface articulation. This is kind of an interesting one. Vertical guitar. This is the first version by Le Corbusier. His real name was Charles Edward Jeanneret, so he signs it still that way. Here's the second version that he did shortly thereafter. So sometimes making multiple series of these paintings. A painting, they said, is an association of uncluttered elements, associated, architectured. Isn't that interesting? Have you ever run across that word? Something got architectured. Painting is architectured. In a durable and truly plastic work, it is a form which matters first and foremost, and everything should be subordinate to it. Everything should come together to establish architecturality. Painting is a matter of architecture because it finds its resources in volume. So they actually saw these as kind of architectural works almost. They're really interested in the relationships between volumes. So all of these are kind of still lifes, things that were sort of sitting around in the studio that they arranged and painted. One particular thing you might notice is that there are a lot of overlapping transparent volumes, and sometimes those overlapped areas become figures in themselves, almost stronger than the outlines of the objects that they're trying to depict. There are also some really interesting things that happen. I think you can kind of see it here, where the water pitcher, maybe the bottle, and the edge of the guitar come together. So there's a kind of marriage of objects in sharing an outline, the linkage of compositional elements to create a unique object in a painting. This one is by Ozenfant, but you see some of these kinds of things in Le Corbusier's paintings as well. Look at this little area right here where the bowl and the bottle overlap. It almost becomes a stronger figure than some of those depicted objects, right? And there are many situations like that in these paintings. So what about Le Corbusier's architecture? So in the morning, he's painting those paintings. In the afternoon, he's working in the office on projects like this. The Villa Stein for Gertrude Stein's sister, in a town called Garches. 1926. And you've probably seen these famous drawings of the elevations, right? The kind of proportions, the regulating lines. And behind most of those paintings, there's kind of a similar kind of set of regulating lines. So this is a study for a painting, and that's sort of the geometric kind of structure, the proportions of the various elements and areas of the painting laid out. And you see that not only in the elevations, but also in the plan. And these Colin Rose studies, comparisons between a Palladio villa and a villa by, this villa by Le Corbusier, you know, the kind of regulating lines that are governing how the whole plan is laid out. There's also something that perhaps Le Corbusier learned in making those paintings related to how you might lay out a canvas and how you might lay out a plan, you know, the free plan. So if you look at some of these floors, for instance, particularly this one in that villa, Corbu boasted, actually, I also show with curved partitions, easy to build, how one obtains 2 bedrooms with their bath and a space that would normally have allowed only one traditional room. So some of this kind of free plan partitioning, he sort of thought had to do with how you might better use space in a building. These are some of the paintings now from the 1930s, so they evolve a little bit. The obsession with transparency is still there, right? As figures overlap, they often kind of exhibit formal inversions. The paintings also have a kind of plasticity. This time, not so much a plasticity of shape, but of readings. So it's kind of like the power of acquisition, right? How you might interpret these. They have a kind of unfamiliar character, a kind of strangeness about them. The lines and the figures defy easy and singular interpretation or recognition. They're no longer composed of simple geometric shapes or forms, but they still evoke those primary sensations. And that leads to kind of multiple interpretations. By the way, in the architecture office and in the dean's office, there are some prints of some of these, not these particular ones, but some beautiful ones. You should take note next time you're in either of those offices, because they're really quite beautiful. There's a collection that were part of Dean Burchard's collection back years ago. So these are not an abandonment of the earlier principles, but they're evidence that Le Corbusier's ideas about primary form have evolved. And of course, you know, this project in the 1950s, pretty much concurrent with, you know, something like that or that. In that context, you really read this building also as having to do with primary form. Not cylinders, cubes, but forms that don't have a singular reading or interpretation that might foster multiple interpretations. And of course, you've seen these cartoons about that building where, you know, the chapel at Ronchamp is the hat of the nun or the back of the duck or the ship. that building can engender all of these kinds of possible interpretations. Okay, however, I'm going to give you a caution here, because I don't think the relationship between Le Corbusier's painting and his architecture can be quite so direct. There might be some points where you say, okay, yeah, I learned that in a painting and I applied it immediately to a building. Le Corbusier was not just painting to help him figure out solutions to his architectural works, right? These things might have a kind of similarity of structure or a kind of analogical relationship, right? That where the painting and the work of architecture shares a kind of structural relationship. So the best way I can explain that idea of analogy is these kinds of questions. Did you all have to take the SAT or the ACT? Do you have questions like this on it? I think they've kind of removed a lot of those from the SAT now, but when I took it, it was just 90% of the questions were kind of like this. And this is not an SAT official question, I just made it up. But there are a lot of questions like this. You might recognize them. So it says, Pythagoras is to ancient Greece as dish towel is to what? You know, and here are some choices. A, bacon. B, number. You know, Pythagoras thought that the substratum of the cosmos is number, right? C, kitchen. And D, fluffy. So what is it? Yeah. So, you know, it's interesting. So it has to do simply with location or a place that you might find that entity in. You know, Pythagoras has nothing to do with dish towel. You know, it's not, there's no direct one-to-one correspondence, but it's the relationship between Pythagoras and ancient Greece that's similar to the relationship between a dish towel and a kitchen. And of course, you know, you can write it in different ways, these kinds of things. Analogia in Greek, we sometimes call it proportion, which is the same word in Latin, right? And Pythagoras would have thought about maybe a string, right? And how you might pluck a string and the sound that it would make, and the relationship between one string and another one. I'm going to back up here, see if it, oops, okay. So there's a tone, right? The full length of the string. What if we divide it in half? Now we get a different sound, right? And that's called an octave, right? The string ratio of 1 to 2, or 2 to 1. And of course, if we make a rectangle out of it, that's what it would look like, that octave relationship, right? So if we divide that string differently, let's say now in a ratio of 3 to 2, so that makes a musical fifth. Four to 3 would be a musical fourth. A third. Called a minor third. See how different dark that sounds compared to the major third? Really kind of interesting. But just by a slightly different ratio of where you would stop that string, right, it would make that sound. And then a sixth. And a minor sixth. This last one, incidentally, is part of the Fibonacci series. It's very close to the golden section. You know, not exactly, but as that Fibonacci series continues, it closer and closer approximates the golden section. And of course, that's the specific ratio that produces the golden section. And of course, it produces a kind of continuing progression of various rectangles that are similar to each other, a proportional kind of sequence, right? Or proportional series. Together with the octave, they form the basis of Le Corbusier's kind of thoughts about measure that you would find in the modular, right? So two series related by golden section proportions and also by that ratio of 1 to 2. Okay, so all of that is kind of introduction to discussing this building by Le Corbusier. This is a significant building in my development as an architect. Le Corbusier's monastery, Sainte Marie de la Tourette. I visited this building a few years after graduation. We didn't have a study abroad program in my school, so I couldn't go to Europe like many of you have. So I had to wait till I graduated and after I'd made enough money to afford to go. And one of the buildings I visited was this one. There's the plan, right? And I had studied this in school. I thought, okay, I know this building, right? Very simple, rational solution to the problem, right? 100 cells, 100 monks, 3 wings around a central courtyard, church on the 4th side of the courtyard, simple. There's the aerial view of it. Corbu evidently was asked to go visit a medieval monastery called Les Tournai, or Tournai Abbey in Provence. That's the plan. I thought, yep, it's a convenient formal type for Corbu to adopt, right? The cloistered courtyard, church on one side, all the other buildings surrounding the courtyard. So I sort of had the impression, really, that this building was kind of like a machine for monks, like a machine for serving God. And that's about the extent of my understanding of it before I visited there. If I had visited this building first, I might have caught on, but I didn't. Evidently, Le Corbusier said of this building, this Gothic or medieval monastery at Les Tournai, light and shadow are the loudspeakers of this architecture of truth. when I finally did get to visit this building, I have to confess, it was not at all what I expected. And I didn't anticipate the emotional content that a building might have. And I have to tell you, the experience of visiting this building shook the foundations of my understanding of architecture to the core. I mean, it was that significant of an event, right? So I'll recount a few of these things. Obviously, I can't cover everything about it, but as Colin Rowe mentions in his essay about La Tourette, you know, how do you arrive? So one of the times I visited, I walked from the chateau across the field. This was later. You know, there's some fences. I couldn't get the gate open. I had to climb the fence, you know, to follow Colin Rowe's path. But, you know, he talks about walking toward the monastery across this field, and you come close to it, and you're confronted with a kind of profile view. You think you're going to attain the other side when you get up to the top, and you'll see the front, the face, right? And you're confronted with another profile looking the other way, you know? It's a very painterly condition. You then can enter, and here's the plan, the entrance, the classrooms and all of the common spaces on this level, and the kind of courtyard in the center. There were little things that I thought, hey, that's a good idea, you know? But, you know, I still was pretty much mesmerized, not able to quite comprehend all that I was seeing. When you go there, you get your own cell, study abroad program. It's the only time you're by yourself in the room. And the room is beautifully proportioned to sort of the human body according to the resources of the module, or that system of measure that Le Corbusier developed. There are all the cells, 100 monks. Another thing that shocked me was the sloppiness of the construction. I thought, up to that point, you know, I'd worked in offices. The quality of a work of architecture ought to depend on the quality of construction, right? Better the construction, the better the architecture. Well, you know, look at this. You know, that parapet wiggles like 3 or 4 inches, you know, on that line, and it's beautiful, you know. So that shook an assumption that I had. And then here's one. This is a really big mystery, or was to me. Maybe it's obvious to you. But I had seen these pictures and these chunks of concrete sticking out. I sort of had assumed those are the ends of the beams that are holding up the building, sticking out, right? It didn't occur to me, of course, that if that was the case, then those windows would be way above eye level. Or if they were at eye level, you'd have to duck under the beams as you walked by, right? And as you look closer, here's one of the hallways that faces into that central cloistered courtyard. And that's what it is. It's like a rectangular chunk of concrete jammed into the horizontal window at about eye level. What the heck? I mean, this is what I was thinking. What is Le Corbusier doing here? And so that's a little section of it. The hallway here, the horizontal window, and that chunk of concrete periodically sort of jammed in there. So what is what is this about? So I'll throw out my theory, maybe you have a better one. So remember the monastery at Les Tournelles, the kind of example that Le Corbusier visited. Around that central courtyard is an ambulatory. There's a really thick wall there, right? You see it? It looks like this. It has a lot of arched openings in it that look out into the courtyard, right? And in them is a kind of secondary arch and a fairly short, squat column. But you can sort of see the thickness of that wall. And as you walk along the ambulatory, of course, you know, you can't really see out into the courtyard except the little piece of it that is immediately adjacent to where you're walking, right? You can't see out obliquely. There's another view of the same thing from the other side. And I think that what Le Corbusier is doing is creating that situation of thickness. But it's also a kind of inversion, because the thickness happens only in that one little moment where the column is, rather than everywhere. And everywhere else the wall is thin, right? So there's a column right here. The column expands to make that chunk of concrete. And that creates a kind of thickness. So right there where you look out, you also can't see out obliquely. You have to look directly across to the other side of the courtyard. So immediately it's a kind of reference to Les Tournelles, but it's also a kind of inversion of that. And that's a condition that I think occurred in a lot of those paintings too. So it's a very indirect relationship. But I think perhaps those things helped Le Corbusier kind of think about what he was doing as he designed this building. Here's the courtyard one level below. There are a series of pathways that cut across it, and ultimately a little atrium here in front of the refectory, eating place, and then a little ramp down to the church. I'll just show a few of these. There was a guy working for Le Corbusier. His name was Ioannis Xenakis. It starts with an X. He was a kind of civil engineer, a mathematician, a musician, but he worked for Le Corbusier to basically kind of as the project architect for this project. And his stories show how a kind of sense of playfulness in the design of the building was involved in the working out of the various conditions in the building. Le Corbusier was a kind of master at establishing constraints that still allowed him the freedom to continue to make further decisions. And here's one example that Xenakis talks about. He had sort of figured out some supporting walls that would support that atrium and would basically hold up parts of the refectory. He thought, well, we'll just extend those walls down to the ground, right? And then he said, to lighten them visually, I tore them into rather free-form combs and into curves, which Le Corbusier accepted with a smile. So kind of interesting, you know. Le Corbusier kind of admired that kind of playfulness in these openings that Xenakis worked out. You go down to the church. almost surgical cuts admitting light of various kind of qualities. There's another thing I've got to admit to you. This blew my mind. Sitting in those little pews, you know, those are for the monks, 100, actually 99 of them and one organist. So I sat down in one of them. And there's armrest, right? Put my arms on the armrest. Under one arm, the armrest was like this, concave. Under my other arm, the armrest was like this, convex. Who would think of that, you know? I mean, that's really interesting. Generally, you'd make them all the same, right? You design one, that would be for all of them. But that's a kind of window into the way this architect is thinking. And of course, this high altar, which Xenakis said they had to sort of lower a little bit because he'd originally considered it a little bit too Aztec as a place for terrible sacrifices. But it is quite high, you know, this altar, if you've been there. And then, of course, these light cannons in the crypt. Which is just down below. There's another story about this little oratory, little prayer chapel. So they designed it as a cube. It actually had been left out of the program, and then they finally realized they had to have it, so they just kind of put it into the courtyard space as a little cube. And Xenakis says he worked really hard to kind of get it in there and figure out how to put it. He made a little model. When Le Corbusier saw it, he asked him to immediately cut out a little paper pyramid, you know, and he was playing with it sort of on top of that little cube. I think Xenakis was a little afraid, you know. No, don't mess it up, don't mess it up, you know, but Le Corbusier kept kind of trying this slightly skewed kind of pyramid that adorns the top of the oratory chapel. There's another image of it. It also has this little light scoop on one side. Xenakis said, you know, that pyramid was not in the same family as the other forms. Nevertheless, Le Corbusier kept the pyramid. And then finally, these undulating glass walls. Le Corbusier kind of called them musical glass planes. The spacings of the mullions varies according to the measures of the modular. Some of those measures and of course those might relate to various measures in a building. And there's one of the large west-facing walls with those so-called undulating glass facades. They're actually simply planar, but they have varying spacings of mullions and various spacings of panels of glass. These are the drawings that Le Corbusier and Xenakis made. And there were many, many variations of it, but basically they were governed by certain sort of musical relationships. Xenakis was, at the time, writing a musical composition. It's called Metastasis. It's for 61 musicians, 46 of them are string instruments, and they sort of start together and then they all kind of go in different directions, right? They all have individual parts. There are these kind of glissandi, which is that image. You'll hear, because I'm going to play it in a second, I'm going to strain your patience, because this is not top 40 music, by the way. The second movement is written in a 12-tone scale based on the Fibonacci series, which approximates the golden section. And Xenakis says this, it's constructed on a combinatorial organization of melodic intervals, plus or minus 1, plus or minus 2, plus or minus 3, plus or minus 4, plus or minus 5, plus or minus 6, expressed in semitones. So this is a kind of musical idea. I'm going to play it for you. Hopefully this will work. Okay, that's the end of it. So let me just kind of leave you with just a question here. In a school, at least in this one, you have a tremendous freedom, scolae, leisure, freedom of thought and exploration to pursue any inquiry wherever it leads you. For its own sake, as its own end, please make the most of it. Now, my faculty colleagues will kill me if I don't say, please do your assignments too. Sometimes the faculty go to great lengths to craft assignments for you that actually attempt to preserve your leisure. So be aware of that. And I'll just leave you with a question. What is for you, what is your secret laboratory? Making music, painting, drawing, writing, ceramics, screen printing, making furniture, photography, dance, making a film, I was telling my thesis students that I remember a thesis student a number of years ago who made a film as part of her thesis. You know, those are things that are possible in an architecture school. These things are important not only for your own edification, but also for the life of the school. So yeah, please make the most of that academic freedom that you have. Thank you.